The pandemic facing the world caused by COVID-19. As of March 2022, the number of people infected throughout the world has exceeded 450 million, and the virus has claimed 6 million lives. In this situation, those at the forefront of healthcare settings continue working on ways to treat and care for people infected with COVID-19 and are trying to fully understand the disease. There are numerous factors that complicate how the virus spreads, including the type of contact between people and the nature of the virus itself. A scientific approach that utilizes the latest data in response to constantly changing circumstances will hopefully provide the key to striking a balance between infection control and economic activities. The COVID-19 AI&Simulation project has been implemented in Japan since 2020. Its purpose is to visualize how the coronavirus spreads using a scientific approach from a variety of perspectives, including the fields of medicine and infectious disease, and by collecting wisdom from multiple academic disciplines. Kitano Hiroaki is a member of the AI&Simulation Project Expert Committee.
Around April 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was starting, I was approached with a request to coordinate a team being set up to leverage technology to develop measures for addressing COVID-19. Of course, since this is a global problem and a massive national emergency, I agreed to undertake the coordination effort in the hope of being useful. The objective of this project is to examine ways of addressing COVID-19 through utilizing technology. The work entails two parts. The first, concerning ways to prevent infection, entails the simulation and visualization of droplets. And the second, infection simulation, aims at predicting what will happen when the pandemic spreads and finishes, and what kind of effects will be imparted by what kind of measures. We hope that the results of this research will prove useful when compiling industry-separate guidelines, or that we can provide data and simulation results that benefit society as a whole. I see this as our mission.
Part 1. Visualizing the microscopic phenomenon of droplet infection. COVID-19 is believed to be spread mainly by droplets and aerosols emitted by infected people. However, these particles are so small we cannot see them, and there was a concern about what to do about this when COVID-19 first started to spread. To alleviate people's anxiety and help them take appropriate precautions, it is necessary to visualize these invisible droplets and aerosols and come up with appropriate measures based on scientific knowledge. Professor Tsubokura Makoto of Kobe University and team leader of Riken Center for Computational Science is an expert in fluid mechanics, which is the study of air and water flows. Using the world's fastest supercomputer, Fugaku, he created a model to show the scattering of droplets and aerosols, which are believed to be an important cause of infections.
When we started this work in the spring of 2020, we were working from home. Researchers who ordinarily take little interest in world affairs were able to see news about COVID-19 every day. One time, a member said to me, "Can't we also help to prevent infections by researching COVID-19 in some form or other?" So we quickly assembled all the team members to think about what we could do. Fortunately, since we were in an environment in which Fugaku was available, we decided to utilize it to forecast aerosol infections. The situations in which people become infected differ greatly according to conditions in society. Since we were able to use an outstanding supercomputer in terms of producing accurate information according to the conditions at hand, we could produce information extremely quickly. I think that this has been a major feature of our research.
Infection countermeasures are required in extremely diverse settings, such as public transport, schools, and restaurants. Hence, massive computer resources are needed to simulate such diverse settings. Since it would take over a year if using a household computer, this type of computer cannot be used to examine countermeasures in diverse settings. The computing power of the supercomputer Fugaku allows a huge volume of calculations to be performed quickly. Since the infection status is always in flux, the measures that need to be implemented are also constantly changing. Therefore, Professor Tsubokura's research team attempted to make effective recommendations as needed by keeping an eye on the infection status and changes in people's lifestyles. When the first state of emergency was lifted, they announced a simulation verifying the effectiveness of partitions for people who were resuming office work. This made people aware of the need for partitions and their proper placement. Similarly, when summer vacation was coming to an end for children, results from a simulation that verified the effect of opening windows in classrooms were disclosed, showing what measures were needed as children began returning to school. Moreover, in line with the resumption of economic activities and changes in types of people becoming infected, they have published the results of simulations regarding when singing together, when using taxis and airplanes, when using fixed-route buses, differences in effects according to mask-wearing methods, when using restaurants, and when using stadiums and so on, and they have continued to transmit information with appropriate timing. In recognition of this work, Professor Tsubokura won the 2021 Association for Computing Machinery ACM Gordon Bell Special Prize for COVID-19 research.
When I received the award, the chairperson of the judging committee told me that by forecasting infections in numerous settings in the initial stages of the pandemic, our research was recognized for conveying to society the importance of various countermeasures, such as wearing masks, placing partitions, and conducting ventilation. Until now, we scientists wrote and presented papers, but had little connection with society. However, people who have seen our research outputs reported in the media have let us know their impressions. Various things have been written in emails and to my own social media accounts. The comments also include some fairly harsh views. However, they also point out things that we hadn't noticed before. Such comments have provided hints for the start of new research. In this way, we have really felt the wonder of having communication between scientists and members of the public through the media.
The research team, led by Professor Ota Makoto of Tohoku University Institute of Fluid Science, is developing a new simulation technique that treats airflows, droplet generation, and droplet trajectories as a set, and conducts simulations regarding the generation, scattering, and absorption of aerosol droplets in the respiratory tract. When it came to virus infections, though, the need for experiments to verify simulations began to be recognized. Professor Ota's team, which specializes in physics and engineering, along with medical experts, is researching approaches to simulation that reflect validity by incorporating data from particle size distribution experiments using inactivating virus particles and droplet trajectory speed measurement experiments.
By measuring particle shapes and quantities of aerosol droplets using inactivating viruses and infectious raw viruses, and thereby measuring virus potency in conditions close to actual droplets, we verify simulations of aerosol droplet generation in the body. Moreover, through simulating aerosol droplet generation based on the technology we established here, scattering and absorption, we aim to identify the conditions that heighten the risk of aerosol infection and link this to calling on people to pay attention regarding their individual behavior.
This visualization shows the results of computer simulation for understanding the location of the respiratory tract where droplets are generated. As shown, droplets are generated continuously from the small diameter respiratory tract called B2, especially the mucous membrane near the bifurcation. It is believed that as the wall shear stress caused by the flow of air increases, particles are generated because the airflow merges near the bifurcation and easily contacts the wall. Here, the horizontal axis indicates the diameter of the droplets, and the vertical axis indicates the number of particles. As can be seen, the particles have a high mucosal viscosity and are mostly around 100 nanometers in size. It is believed that the importance of these 100 nanometer particles will be fully understood in the future by measuring the virus potency of the particles.
Our simulation findings pointed to the possibility that many minute particles, the size of a single virus, are generated in the respiratory tract. We also found that particles are generated near the bifurcation of the respiratory tract. We hope that this will prove useful when setting conditions for simulation of indoor environments, and that by conducting simulations with high accuracy, we can link to cautioning people regarding their individual behavior. In this way, expertise in the respective fields of engineering, medicine, experimentation, and simulation can be pooled to clarify the virus's characteristics. We anticipate that the viral characteristics can be utilized as basic knowledge to help not only simulate indoor environments and vehicle environments, but also accurately forecast virus generation, absorption, and other conditions in patients with respiratory diseases.
Team leader Wada Satoshi is engaging in research with photon engineering to visualize the droplets and aerosols that carry viruses. His results, including evaluations of face masks and virus inactivation using light, will not only help to create safer spaces, but will also greatly contribute to simulations of all environments.
Until now, we had no idea about infection routes at all. So first of all, we made it one of our objectives to visualize droplet infection routes. Droplets coming out of people's mouths contain a lot of moisture. Only this moisture has an optical wavelength that absorbs light. By applying a special light, it becomes possible to clearly see the flow of moisture through air. By showing this, we could see how such airflows moved and visualized the transmission of droplets from person to person. Naturally, we also measured the sizes and speeds of droplets.
In this experiment, a tracer was placed in a subject's mouth to visualize the spread of microdroplets when they speak under various conditions, such as with or without a face mask, and with or without air conditioning. By doing this, you can see how normally invisible microdroplets spread. Using this technology, they performed experiments at different temperatures and humidity levels to clarify the characteristics of microdroplets. The data shows the importance of face masks, air conditioners, and humidity control. Research is also being conducted on light curtains. It has been shown that light curtains can inactivate viruses, thereby making it possible to create spaces where people can meet safely in person without placing physical partitions.
We have measured how conditions change completely between when a mask is worn, when a mask is not worn, when the air conditioner is on, and when the air conditioner is off. In extremely dangerous cases, depending on the direction of the wind, you can infect another person if they are in front of you, or regardless of whether you are outside or inside, you can infect somebody who is by your side. Or when you are walking, droplets can cause infection to others who pass you by. Therefore, the first thing we realized was that unless we analyze where and how the breath exhaled by people floats and drifts in various environments, there is a risk of infection in any environment. Next, since we could visualize these droplets, we could measure the mask transmissivity of droplets. As a result, we found that masks made from non-woven fabric are good at shutting out droplets. I think that we were able to show the superiority of non-woven fabric masks based on solid data.
Part 2. Quantitative data analysis of infection situation as a social phenomenon. When COVID-19 is viewed as an individual disease, it belongs to the medical research field. However, factors related to its spread or control need to be analyzed based on interactions among people. The SIR model has long been used as a mathematical model for understanding the flow of human-to-human transmission. This model divides people into 3 groups: people who are susceptible to infection, people who are currently infected, and people who have recovered from the infection and have acquired immunity. It also takes into consideration the infection rate, period until quarantine, and the time it takes to recover. In this SIR model, human society exists as one densely populated world. So, if one person becomes infected, the infection will spread to everyone in society. However, in the real world, communities are not that cohesive. They are much more complicated and diverse. In reality, there are small worlds where small communities interact in different ways. A disease may spread in areas with infected people, yet not spread quickly to people in other areas. Analysis of how infection spreads via intricate system networks requires the analysis of large, complex structures that exist in the real world, including different types of human behaviors based on common properties. This concept is explained here. With COVID-19, it is necessary to consider the characteristics of human contacts and mobile networks. Suppose everyone is confined to their homes due to the spread of COVID-19 and people are refraining from activities. Some people live by themselves. Others may have a family made up of 5 people. Now suppose there are 2 infected people in this network. What happens when each person becomes active? When an infected person meets and eats with a family member who lives somewhere else or talks with friends at school, the infection spreads. In other words, as people engage in activities, networks are continuously rearranging. Therefore, the more activity there is, the more often networks are rearranged, resulting in the formation of more clusters. However, if from the beginning people limit their behavior, wear masks, and are vaccinated, such networks can be disrupted and the spread of infections prevented. Changes in the network structure create changes in the flow of infection. This is why different simulation models are needed. The ways that an infection spreads and is controlled are uncertain and include diverse elements, such as changes in people's behavior, the wearing of face masks, the progress of vaccinations, vaccine efficacy against mutant strains, available medical resources, and the issuing of states of emergency. When these are included, it becomes possible to have more accurate simulations. COVID-19 AI and Simulation. In this project, complex networks are utilized for conducting comparative analysis and verification based on diverse simulation models.
In this project, we assembled experts from various fields, such as SIR modeling, complex networking, AI multi-agent modeling, and deep learning research, and conducted research from diverse approaches, asking questions such as, what could possibly happen? What could happen when certain measures are taken? And how should vaccines be administered? We presented data to the government and advanced the project in the hope of contributing to high-quality decision-making that reflects as many multifaceted views as possible. In this way, by viewing from various approaches, we can take different viewpoints. For example, this model predicts that many people will become infected, whereas this model shows that infections will decline after reaching a certain peak. This allows us to determine or debate which approach is best suited to the conditions at hand. Therefore, it's extremely important to be able to adopt a multifaceted approach.
These are some of the researchers working on simulations with these models. Professor Kurihara Satoshi of Keio University believes that the main factor in the spread of COVID-19 is people's behavior. He therefore focuses on social sensing data, such as social media and news reports. In addition to such real-time data, he also considers mobile networks inside and between cities, which are close to the real world. In doing so, he performs analysis for detecting the spread of infections.
The way a disease is transmitted largely depends on the way people move and contact each other. Since these are key requirements, we create simulations that carefully incorporate human behavioral patterns and behavioral networks. Specifically, people do not normally act irrationally, but they sometimes act without restraint. This phenomenon is referred to as the power law. As a result, people tend to behave based on this kind of distribution. Our lives consist of scattered, dense communities, such as our homes and workplaces. These points are connected by transportation routes, such as bicycles and buses. Such networks are called small world networks. Therefore, the two main elements we use to create simulations are the power law and small world networks. This allows us to create fairly accurate simulations, including the ability to reproduce and predict infections that began last year. Therefore, when a new virus strain like Omicron appears, we can immediately make predictions in this way. We are developing and using the simulations that make this possible.
This shows the results of Professor Kurihara's research on how the Omicron strain has impacted the spread of infections. This research was conducted in early December when the Omicron strain was just being identified as a new mutant strain. At that time, the infectivity of the Omicron strain was still unknown. However, Professor Kurihara simulated the infectivity strength by dividing it into multiple patterns. This clearly demonstrated that if infectivity is high, it would be necessary to take measures aimed at suppressing people's movement, similar to states of emergency issued in the past. Professor Kurihara's research results prove that scientific knowledge can be used to identify what measures may be needed in the future, taking advantage of the characteristics of simulations that can estimate the spread of infections in various situations.
Creating simulations is rewarding since these have been used for things like policy formulation. However, there is still much that can be done to improve simulations. Of course, we have been able to identify the main aspects of human behavior and networks, but in reality, people are all different, and behavior is affected by things like the weather and various schedules. Also, in Japan, there are earthquakes and other disasters. Therefore, if we don't use such research as an opportunity to carry out large-scale simulations that incorporate various factors such as social simulations, we will be unable to respond quickly when something happens in the future. This work is just the beginning, and I hope it will grow into a much larger project for creating full-scale and multi-scale simulations.
Professor Osawa Yukio analyzes the dynamics of infection spread using mathematical models that investigate different levels, including interregional connections and individual behaviors at home and with family members and friends. In this research, focus is placed on acquiring knowledge for explaining what causes the spread of infection and its impact rather than on the accuracy of predictions.
Regarding our objective, we research simulation geared to seeking universal infection countermeasures. For example, lifestyle approaches and vaccination strategies. Basically, we want to create a new model. If such a model, or should I say a simple hypothesis to explain reduction of infection, is an effective representation of society, we will be able to predict future developments through simulation. This differs slightly from numerical forecasting, however. The aim is to acquire the ability to explain what will happen if certain things are done.
Professor Osawa is proposing an action guideline called Stay with Your Community during periods when infection is spreading. This is based on what has been shown in simulations. The overall risk of infection only increases sharply when the number of contacts with unfamiliar people is higher than the number of contacts with familiar people. Infections did not spread as widely in Japan as in other countries. Analysis shows that this may be because Japanese people tend to mainly spend time with people they meet regularly.
Stay with your community. In simple terms, this means it is acceptable for people to have a certain degree of contact with their regular community, but they should avoid contact with strangers. We discovered that this could impart a very large effect in terms of preventing the spread of infections. When people are told to stay home, they stay inside. However, as soon as they are told it's okay to go out again, they have contacts with multiple other people. So the principle of stay with your community is disrupted. If anything, if people properly upheld the principle of stay with your community, economic activities could be vitalized more than under the policy of stay home. In various senses, stay with your community is more effective. We have found that stay with your community imparts extremely universal effects, and a number of local governments are verifying it.
Professor Unemi Tatsuo has developed a simulation based on a multi-agent system to analyze the impact of people's movements, gatherings, contact tracing, testing, vaccination, and so on during the pandemic. He hopes to develop a universal system in response to COVID-19 that will help prevent the spread of other infectious diseases in the future.
We are continuing to develop a simulation based on a multi-agent system that models individual behaviors and progression of the infection and symptoms together with changes in circumstances. We are facing many new elements one after another, including the emergence of mutant strains, the progress of vaccinations, and the development of new therapeutic agents. Therefore, we are constantly performing simulations as needed so that these elements can be included in the analysis.
As shown here, with the multi-agent system, the number of people representing the population is placed on a two-dimensional square plane. Each individual moves long distances and meets with other people during the day, and then returns to his or her home position in the evening. Moreover, when an uninfected person approaches an infected person, there is a certain probability that infection will occur. By carefully adjusting parameters, such as the movement pattern and the infection probability, it is possible to replicate real-world phenomena, such as considering when to lift a state of emergency and the effects of vaccines or testing. For example, this graph suggests there is a difference between the actual number of positive cases and the reported number of new positive cases due to the maximum number of tests that can be conducted for the Omicron strain.
When facing a difficult situation, many people feel, how can I help solve the problem by utilizing my skills? I was mainly working on creating new media art with computers, but remembering the research I had previously done on intelligence using multi-agents, I decided to start this project because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was able to collect basic knowledge, such as how differences in population size impact the dynamics of infection. There are still many issues to be overcome, but I hope that I can make some contribution to help resolve the different problems people are facing.
To determine the effectiveness of infection prevention measures, Professor Kurahashi Setsuya of the University of Tsukuba uses an agent-based model together with AI to model phenomena related to infections in urban environments and in the home with mathematical models using optimized parameters. This makes it possible to examine the priority of vaccinations, estimate the effectiveness of state of emergency issuance, and predict the spread of successively occurring new mutant strains.
Since COVID-19 infections occur when people come into contact with other people, our research is focused on interperson relationships. It is very important to understand what kind of people are in what places now. It has recently become possible to acquire such data, the most important of which is mobile space statistical data, which can be acquired using smartphone GPS information. We can understand roughly how many people are out in entertainment districts at 9 o'clock in the evening. Moreover, we can acquire hourly information showing roughly how many people from outside of the area or outside of Tokyo have entered Tokyo today. Using such data, we aim to create a model that superimposes human flows over the actual infection situation.
This is a prediction made by Professor Kurahashi on how the number of new positive cases will change in Tokyo due to the Omicron strain. When he started to make predictions in December 2021, not all information on the Omicron strain was available, and there were other issues to consider, such as the timing of booster shots, the use of vaccine passports, the number of people in downtown areas, and the Omicron infection rate. He subsequently upgraded the forecast by updating the infection rate and the number of people in downtown areas, and periodically examined the latest analysis results and effective approaches to countermeasures. This made it possible to come up with an early estimation of new mutant strains while considering the actual situation in Japan and also noting the infection situation in other countries.
Whenever such simulations are created, people tend to think the forecast is correct or the estimation was successful, and so on. However, that is not our intention. Obviously, we seek accuracy. But more than that, ultimately it comes down to letting people make judgments about policy options, while showing to a certain extent what will happen if this is done or it isn't done. Decisions are made by individuals, companies, or governments. However, we aim to provide decision makers with materials that can broadly describe the scenarios, risks, and merits. Ultimately, we hope that such persons can use our findings to help them arrive at decisions.
Dr. Chiba Asako of the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research quantitatively evaluates COVID-19 countermeasures such as vaccines, antibody cocktails, and restrictions on the flow of people using an agent-based model. She also focuses on the impacts of COVID-19 in society by analyzing changes in numbers of births and marriages, nursery school closures, and so on.
We perform modeling of people's everyday, usual behavior. In doing so, we analyze how COVID-19 spreads through society and how effective various measures that are actually implemented to counter the spread of COVID-19 are. Taking the actual population of Japan, we appropriately downscaled this and represent each member of society in a simulation on a computer. Within the simulation, we recreate the ways that people behave in various settings. For example, going to work, going into town, having meals, going to school, and so on. The strength of this model lies in being able to more directly understand the effectiveness of COVID-19 countermeasures that aim at actually limiting the behavior of the population.
In this analysis, mobile phone base station information was incorporated into an agent-based model to see the impact that long-distance travel has on the spread of infections. By doing so, the risk of spreading infections if domestic travel were resumed was assessed. Based on this, it was suggested that if daily outings could be limited, increased long-distance domestic travel would have only a small impact. On the other hand, it was also suggested that more daily outings would have a major impact on the spread of infections.
Restricting long-distance travel is effective in the early stages of infection. However, we have found that the effect is weaker if this is done after infections have already spread around the country. This is an extremely intuitive finding. However, we have also discovered that the timing of implementing countermeasures greatly impacts the effects. Having embarked on analysis of COVID-19 countermeasures, we have found a new sense of motivation in the realization that our results can prove useful for society. It has given us a new sense of purpose.
Associate Professor Nakata Taisuke of the University of Tokyo incorporates economic activity into his SIR model. He analyzes the effectiveness of various requests that accompany the declaration of a state of emergency and measures to prevent the spread of mutant strains from the perspectives of both controlling the spread of infection and the medium to long-term impacts on economic activities. Amidst the need to strike a balance between controlling the spread of infection and sustaining economic activities, he is working on rapidly analyzing many different scenarios.
When the second state of emergency was issued for Tokyo, and policy discussions were conducted regarding when it should be lifted, we conducted analysis for predicting how certain criteria for lifting would impact the aggregate number of fatalities in the medium to long term, and economic losses in the long term. We realized that lifting the state of emergency, after first suppressing infections to an extent, even if this entails paying an economic price in the short term, may mitigate the subsequent spread of infections and thereby reduce the risk of having to issue a new state of emergency or closing down society again. Therefore, we found that even if there is economic pain in the short term, this may not necessarily be a negative thing in the medium to long term.
This analysis was conducted by Associate Professor Nakata in September of 2021. The vaccination rate has improved and infections have recently been suppressed. However, evaluations have been conducted based on a long-term perspective. From a 5-year perspective, the number of newly infected people repeatedly rises and falls like waves. However, there is a clear difference in the magnitude of such waves based on differences in vaccination rates and other factors. This analysis was conducted by Associate Professor Nakata in February of 2022. Transitions in infections were analyzed by quickly incorporating the new severity standard that considers the characteristics of the Omicron strain indicated by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government in early February. This analysis assumes multiple patterns for infection peaking and estimates the numbers of serious cases and fatalities in each. The analysis showed that there is little likelihood of the number of serious cases exceeding the capacity of available beds in hospitals.
The extremely challenging thing about this pandemic is that not only is it an infectious disease crisis and a public health emergency, but it is also a socio-economic crisis in that measures to contain the spread of infections greatly impact society and the economy. These two aspects are extremely difficult, and when I considered what I could do as a researcher, I thought that it would be good to have a single framework for simultaneously considering both sides.
Professor Hirata Akimasa of the Nagoya Institute of Technology considered how changes in people's behavior influence the spread of infections and is conducting simulations on how declaring a state of emergency changes people's movements. He has also conducted machine learning using not only domestic data, but also data from cities outside Japan that have experienced the spread of infections and led the way in vaccinations, with a view to analyzing effective vaccination scenarios for controlling infections.
My research entails using AI to forecast how the number of infected persons will change from now on. Conventional methods have involved experimenting with mathematical models and inputting lots of parameters. However, rather than using these, we have tried to let AI do all the work in searching for the related parameters and inputting them to reproduce conditions. Among these parameters, the flow of people, in particular the flow of people at transfer train stations, has a big impact. Also on social media, keywords related to risks are bar, drinking party, or karaoke, and so on. Among these, drinking party is especially important. Moreover, we have also analyzed how much vaccine has been administered while considering herd immunity.
This is an analysis performed in late January, when infections of the Omicron strain were rapidly increasing. This model shows the number of passengers using train stations and the number times the keyword drinking party appeared on Twitter. These were added as indexes showing the flow of people. Characteristics of the Omicron strain, the progress of booster shots, and the decline of immunity over time are also taken into consideration. Also, since many people with the highly infectious Omicron strain are asymptomatic, the reinfection prevention effect was newly added. This study resulted in the establishment of a model allowing for examination of more effective countermeasures by having simulations that take such various factors into account, thereby making it possible to predict when the number of infections will peak and evaluate effective parameters based on that purpose.
Before working on this project, I was forecasting the number of patients requiring ambulance treatment due to heat stroke. Specifically, I was concerned with when and where ambulances would be needed. Actually, this is almost the same as forecasting how many people will become infected with COVID-19. Although the inputted parameters differ slightly, I conducted forecasts while considering factors such as weather conditions and human flows. However, on participating in this project, I was made aware of social media keywords that had not been necessary, or I had never noticed in conventional forecasting of the number of heat stroke patients requiring ambulance treatment. I was surprised to find that by knowing and incorporating these keywords, it became possible to make extremely accurate estimations.
Data collection is the key to accurately understanding the infection status. It was thought that grasping the actual number of infections would be extremely difficult, since some people with COVID-19 are asymptomatic. From February to December of 2021, PCR tests were collected from more than 1 million asymptomatic people in Japan. Tests were conducted at various locations, such as train stations and airports, shopping areas, offices, factories, construction sites, and schools in 14 prefectures, from Hokkaido in the north to Okinawa in the south, mainly in areas where a state of emergency had been issued during the third wave, which peaked in early January of 2021. The results were used to indicate the positive rate for each prefecture and the positive rate for each age group on websites, and to set parameters for simulating infections. Test results also suggested that the positive rate for asymptomatic people in Japan remained low compared to other countries, which helped to clarify the infection status in Japan. On the other hand, research is underway on new and easier testing methods for monitoring infections in consideration of life after COVID-19. Assistant Professor Motooka Daisuke of the Research Institute for Microbial Diseases at Osaka University is working with Shionogi Pharma in an effort to detect the epidemiology of COVID-19 infections at an early stage and thereby prevent clusters. They are conducting epidemiological surveys of sewage from facilities such as hospitals and city sewage to detect viruses and perform genome analysis to evaluate and verify its usefulness. They are also doing research to establish simple and fast methods geared to realizing social implementation.
We are primarily concerned with the early detection of pandemics. Infections spread from persons to other persons. Viruses are discharged from our respiratory organs through coughing and so on. Or they may be discharged as diarrhea from the intestinal tract. And from there they are passed on to other people. Since we use toilets and wash our hands, naturally viruses flow into sewage. Therefore, we are now conducting verification to see if we can detect infections at an early stage by analyzing these viruses in the sewage.
In this research on sewage, they are working on developing a method for thickening sparse viruses in sewage, and they have achieved a higher degree of sensitivity than in conventional methods. Through realizing higher sensitivity in this way, they have become able to quantitatively detect viruses from sewage even when the numbers of infected persons are low. Being able to concentrate the virus has also made it easier to analyze the virus genome in sewage and identify epidemic strains. Comprehensive analysis of the viruses contained in sewage even allows for the detection of other viruses that can cause diseases in humans. They can quantitatively measure various viruses and are advancing research geared to surveying the prevalence of all kinds of pathogens.
One thing we have found in the COVID-19 pandemic is the high incidence of latent infections. That is, positive cases who show no symptoms. The problem is that such persons unintentionally pass on the virus to other people. In our research of sewage, since we can also capture viruses discharged by persons with latent infection who show no symptoms, we can roughly estimate how many people are latently infected. I think that this is a merit of sewage epidemiology. If we can effectively leverage this sewage epidemiological analysis, we can quickly detect what kind of viruses are becoming prevalent in which locations. If we can do that, we hope that it will be possible to suppress infections before they become too widespread, and thereby limit the curtailment of economic activities to a minimum.
Professor Toyoda Masashi examined Japanese posts made on Twitter to see how these related to behaviors with a high risk of infection, and compared these with the number of new positive cases of COVID-19. Changes in people's behavior were analyzed according to how infections spread. He is investigating how risk behavior changes according to the time of year and different regional trends.
The central government and local governments have conducted various measures in an effort to contain the spread of COVID-19. However, it is extremely difficult to quantitatively measure how far infections have been reduced or how people have changed their behavior. In our research, we analyze what kinds of words people are using on social media, especially Twitter, to understand how people's behavior has changed. On media such as Twitter, people upload to the internet the things that are happening in their daily lives in real time. This has allowed us to observe trends and changes in people's behavior almost in real time. I think it is important that we've been able to link this to simulations.
This graph shows transitions in new positive cases throughout Japan and the number of tweets related to high-risk behavior. Tweets that are related to high-risk activities, for example, drinking party, karaoke, and visiting parents, are shown in the upper part of the graph, and these are extracted and analyzed using about 30 different language patterns. It can be seen that when the number of new positive cases increased, risk behavior decreased because people exercised restraint. Then, risk behavior increased as the number of new positive cases decreased. In addition to trends on the national level, trends in regions such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Aichi can also be analyzed, and comparisons can be made with the same period the previous year, as shown in this graph. Such analysis will help us understand how people respond and how behavior changes according to situations, such as how the infection is spreading and the issuing of states of emergency.
Judging from our research so far as Japan is concerned, when infections become widespread, we can see that people autonomously limit their behavior a lot, and there is a major decline in risky behavior. The fact that Japanese people tend to limit their behavior a lot when infections become widespread I think, shows that each person decides their actions each day upon carefully examining the information that is published. Up until the fifth wave, I think that this tendency of Japanese people to autonomously change their behavior has, to some extent, contributed to reducing numbers of positive cases in relatively short periods.
Part 3. Leveraging new technologies for taking infection countermeasures and mitigating loads in healthcare settings. In Japan, new technologies have also been used to study infection control and reduce the load placed on healthcare settings. These technologies may help with diagnosis, disease progression prevention, and early diagnosis of after effects. Dr. Okada Naoki, a clinical physician, is developing an AI model for diagnosing COVID-19 using CT images for the purpose of accurately and quickly sorting COVID-19 patients. He has so far succeeded in gathering patient data on more than 4,000 cases from 13 medical institutions in Japan, and he is using this to advance development of an AI model and introduce this to medical care settings.
The goal of this research is to develop a COVID-19 CT diagnosis AI model that is ideally suited to emergency settings in Japan. Numerous such COVID-19 CT diagnosis initiatives are being conducted in Japan and overseas. However, it is difficult to directly use overseas AI models in Japanese emergency settings. It is difficult because the patients arriving at hospitals overseas have different backgrounds to patients arriving at hospitals in Japan. That's why we have broadly collected the data on COVID-19 patients arriving by ambulance in Japan and entered it into the AI. This was the most difficult point.
The AI model developed in this research can be promptly introduced to medical settings as an application that operates on GPU-equipped notebook PCs. Since the model can entirely operate on a PC without connecting to the internet or sending data to an external cloud network and so on, it can be used to safely analyze highly confidential patient data. When a patient's CT is inputted into the application, inference using the internal GPU is conducted, and the analysis is completed in a few seconds. Since the analysis results can be confirmed in connection with the shot CT, it is hoped that this can be utilized to conduct rapid screening in medical care settings.
Emergency rooms in Japan continue to receive many COVID-19 patients, making it impossible for them to return to normal examinations and treatment. We are rapidly introducing this system to hospital emergency rooms in the hope that it can prove even a little useful as soon as possible. In the future, when numbers of COVID-19 patients have gone down, we emergency physicians will no longer need to implement PCR tests on all arriving emergency patients. In this age, CT diagnosis is the only method for discovering latent COVID-19 patients. The same also applies to tuberculosis and so on. In such cases, this system will exhibit its true worth even more.
Through this COVID-19 AI and simulation project, scientists from different fields have come together to provide the right knowledge at the right time from a variety of perspectives, and thereby translate the outputs of their research into social benefits. This project is looking ahead to a new era.
Concerning the kind of research activities we will conduct in the future, for example, taking the case of infection simulation, I think we will investigate ways in which we can return to the pre-COVID-19 world and the conditions that will be required for us to return. For example, what percentage of the population will require booster vaccinations? Will it be necessary to have vaccines tailored to the Omicron variant that are more effective than conventional vaccines? Also, how long will people need to wear masks and take other steps to guard against infection, and so on? Another point is the medical care structure. I think it will become necessary from now on to simulate how much of a medical care structure will need to be prepared.
The fight against COVID-19 is not over, and it is essential that society and science have dialogue to overcome it. To prepare for unknown future pandemics, not only limited to COVID-19, it will be important to accumulate analytical knowledge.